everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ania Williams, and I am a director on the Responsible Technology team at Omidyar Network. And I'm joined here, as you can see, by the wonderful Jess, Aisha, Amit, and Annie. I feel like we're really representing the A names, though, today. Sorry, Jess. You're outnumbered. But no, today we're going to be reflecting on the opportunities and the challenges for new funders to enter this evolving industry. At Omidyar Network, we're actually focused on, and I'm going to use a little bit of marketing speak, bending the arc of the digital revolution towards shared power, prosperity, and possibility. But it has a lot of intersections with what's happening in the entertainment industry, because one of the things that we realized a few years ago is all of the work that we hope to do and impact and hoping to put people at the center of what is happening with technology, also observing the power and the disruptability of technology in industries such as the entertainment one. We know that it's really important for anything that we're trying to do, anything we want to do to make change. Even if we had the cure to cancer, if you're not out here telling stories about it, if you're not tweeting about it, you're not blogging about it, like nobody knows and nobody cares. And so we really started to understand that narrative change is a really, really critical part of the work that we are trying to do to help create the fertile soil for the progress that we would like to see as well. And in 2023, I was very fortunate to have one of my portfolio companies, Seed and Spark. Is anybody here from Seed and Spark today? No? Sad. But Emily Best, who is just such a phenomenal founder, had been putting on Innovators House here at Sundance and invited us to come out. And it really was a very eye-opening experience for me, and really thinking about where we can, or where bridges were already starting to really be built from philanthropy into the entertainment industry, and realizing that there could be more opportunities. And so it really opened up a chance for me to go on a bit of a learning journey to learn more about this industry, and also to just understand what the opportunity is for us to actually increase the impact and to help shift hearts and minds around the work that we do, especially when we are constantly sort of fighting the kind of dominant culture that we've inherited in tech, software eating the world, grow, scale at whatever cost, shareholders first, to something that really is thinking about humans first, technology serving us and not the other way around. And really, how do you start to create the conditions for that mindset, for people to show up, for people to build alternatives in that space too? So with that said, I am very, very excited about this conversation, because I am here first and foremost as a learner, and I hope that anyone else who's in this audience that's interested in learning is going to get a lot of really great nuggets today too. We will also have time for questions and answers, so whatever it is that you're thinking, whatever that burning question is, hold on to that. We're going to get a chance to get to that too. But first, I'm going to take my moderator's privilege and kick this thing off. I really would like to have folks, we thank you, Phil, for the wonderful introductions, but I also want to have you guys introduce yourselves a little bit through sharing how you see your personal relationship to the breaking and remaking of the film industry. So I would really love to have you start with a reaction to the topic. Can a new wave of funders help rebuild the film industry? When you hear this, does it resonate, and what comes up for you? Let's start at the end with Annie.
I think that a new wave of funders need to help rebuild the industry. I don't think that it's can they? It's a necessity at this point, because if we keep having the same money be recycled, we're going to have the same stories. We see it in legislation. If we keep having same people be recycled, it's going to be the same story. So I think it's here, and it's us in this room, and it's all the friends and the people that we know, but it's learning to take the risk,
I agree with that. No, I have to say that I think innovation happens when new minds get introduced to a system, to an industry, and we've seen a lot of companies flourish. I think A24 is one of the things that I hold as kind of a creative bastion in our industry, and it's because they thought differently than a traditional studio. And so I think new funders are going to be the way for this industry to change, and to change in the direction that we want them to change, which is to be more impact-minded, to have a larger purpose in mind. And so, yes.
Wonderful. Aisha.
I come to this work from a kind of artist-first perspective. At the Center for Cultural Power, we start by thinking, what do storytellers need in order to move forward? And so when I think about the question of can new funders rebuild the film industry, what comes up for me is that I don't think we should rebuild an industry that has not worked well for diverse voices. I think, how do we revolutionize the screen sector? How do we acknowledge the moment that we're in and talk about new ways to share stories? And how do we bring philanthropy and folks that fund storytelling on that journey with us? We've seen philanthropists fund big movies, not just small budgets. We've seen philanthropists use storytelling differently, but we have to help them understand that the industry has changed. And so what their goal, at least from my perspective, shouldn't be to rebuild and reinforce damaged systems. Let's tear it all down.
Word. I like the start we're off to here. Jess.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of your work at Center for Cultural Power. I'm very much with you. My work is at the intersection of where movements meet storytelling and kind of can make interventions in our political and social spaces. And when we're talking about philanthropy, any kind of influx of resources into the field, we also need to be talking about how we're organizing those resources to meet the needs of the moment, whether that is about who we're seeing behind the camera and in front of the camera, centering historically and strategically marginalized and excluded folks, Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, trans, disabled, or whether that's looking at a narrative change perspective. And as we've seen in different kind of movement zeniths, like if we look at the response of the industry and funders in 2020, all of a sudden understanding that the movement for Black lives actually, if they're not getting involved there, they're missing something. And that's not because their hearts were changed, that's because they understood the public was not interested in what they're doing unless they're engaging with the movements. And so we're responsible from that groundswell perspective. And that also means like we need to be in relationship with these funders to help kind of bridge the gap between money and movements. And then the other thing I just want to say is that we need money to do the work that we're doing. And philanthropy is the other side of the system of capitalism and commercialism, and it's tied up with those interests. And so we have to be really clear about who we are and what we're doing and set up those expectations with the funders from early on.
I love that note that you ended on. I'm like, first of all, I'm so excited just on, I don't know if you guys are excited, I'm very excited just off of how we kicked this off.
I'm excited.
I'm like,
right
oh my
here
gosh,
with you.
where are we gonna go? So, but I'm like, I feel like this is actually wanting me to kind of go into this question where I'm like, I'm thinking about, I don't know why, my brain is trying to draw this parallel between, I'm like the word that shall not be spoken, DEI work, and also how we think about, philanthropy coming in, big institutional money, all of that stuff. Like, what is the thing, like, where you think about, folks who are not used to being in diverse spaces and they kind of come in and they, have the sort of the right interests at heart, but it's a little bit like, stomping on things and bumping your knees on the chairs and stuff. So like, what would be the thing that you would sort of say to folks who are not from this industry kind of coming in? Like, how do you prevent them from being the bull in the china shop, so to speak? Or what do you want them to like know? Anybody popcorn this?
I think that liberalism has really done us a disservice in thinking that it's like about using the right terms and words to show that we're like allies and insiders. So I think we really need to move away from, are we saying the right word for the right thing to show that we're insiders, but really like, how are we showing up in rooms? Are we showing up listening, leading with listening? Are we showing up with curiosity? Are we showing up respecting the expertise of the people doing the work? And yeah, that's all I want to say.
I'll add to that. I think I agree with that completely. I think one of the things we do at One Community is we do an impact campaign with all of our projects. So I'll create a movie, and then my counterpart, Rachel Cook, will create an impact campaign that supports it. And one thing we learned very early on is that we can't purport to be the experts in any issue area. So what we do with all of our projects is we bring together a brain trust of people who have been in the issue area long before we arrived, and we'll continue the fight long after we leave and move on to the next project, and they advise us what is actually necessary and needed. So for the case of a film that we just put out called Winner, it's about Reality Winner and her leaking documents to flag that the American government knew about Russian meddling in our election. And we thought, we're going to use this movie to save democracy. Like democracy, like we're going to make laws that protect democracy. And we brought together a brain trust from everyone from both sides of the aisle. They sat in a room, they read the script, they spoke to Reality Winner, they discussed what the issue areas are, and they said that that's not the issue. The issue is that young people are no longer trusting democracy, and we need to engage young people to come back to democracy and to use their power to vote, to get them civically engaged, because the more they're involved civically, the more likely they'll graduate upwards to the federal level and be that fresh blood that we need. And so I think allowing people to come in and say, we're not experts, let's learn together, let's learn from the people who have been doing this and make it a community effort, then I think we'll be on the right track.
Annie, I see some face happening. Get in there.
I'm just thinking about what everybody here is saying, and like to your point of saying like we need to have people to trust democracy, but if we're building upon a construct that wasn't built for us anyway, back to your point, I'm like, shit, we got to burn it all down. Like, because from my end, right, like I'm an actress and I'm a producer, and I've been afforded opportunity to be a producer, and in spaces where people look and feel like me, and yet and still I had none of the information that I needed to do it adequately. And I felt like I failed a lot of people that were on, being number one on a project and doing these things. So back to your point, I'm like, yeah, how do we create systems instead that inform someone like myself who's, from the hood, like don't have a higher education, like love this work and am an expert at what I do on the screen as an artist, but don't know anything of the background of it. And even fiscally, like I grew up in a garage, like no one taught me how to do taxes and no one taught me how to build my business so that I can have my money so it just makes me think about creating these systems, but also burning it down. Like what, now I have a question.
All right. Well, I think that this is really interesting because there's so many industries in general that are defined by keeping people on the outside, even just by knowing the language, right? Knowing what to say, knowing what the things mean, all of that being a pretty high barrier for someone to kind of come in, which is like, even when you think about investing, then where you sort of start to see these platforms that democratize this, you get huge waves of funding that start to come in because it's like, oh, actually, I don't have to know what, an index fund if I can just buy this little tiny piece of a stock or whatever, I don't know. But I know that, Jess, there is some of your work that's entailed in kind of helping people who are coming into this with new experience or little to no experience and kind of helping them to understand how to engage. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, do you mean from the funder side or the film?
From the funder side.
Yeah, great. I think it's really important also as we're bringing new funders into the field that we're setting kind of shared language, level expectations, that when we're talking about ROI, whether that's financial or social, what that means and how we're measuring it, what it's gonna look like, that we're setting up opportunities that we are giving them an opportunity to put their money in a direction. Maybe they're coming from wanting to support independent art. Maybe they're coming from interest in particular political movements. And marrying those interests to kind of create the end result. It takes a lot of communication, and it also really means moving away from a transactional and toward a relational approach to like the funder-creator dynamic.
I also am thinking about this in relation to what different ways that there are to engage. I feel like this has already kind of come up in a few different ways. Amit, you mentioned even at One Community, you can come in and you can fund the film itself, like the content. You can also come and fund the impact campaign, which isn't necessarily funding the end product, but the way in which it's going to, be reaching people and helping to influence them. So I'm like, those are two routes right there. I feel like you're speaking also maybe to another route here. And I kind of want to also come over to you, Aisha, where there's a lot of creators and storytellers that are coming through the center that you're working at. I know that you have really, really deep roots in fundraising. I'm really interested to hear about what kind of folks are engaging there. Is it just philanthropy? Are there, regular, everyday people who are coming in that can really engage and try to help support these BIPOC filmmakers?
Yes, our experience has been, whether it's everyday givers, high net worth donors, or whether it's more institutional givers, folks are coming in with a lot of curiosity, but also a lot of misconceptions about the change that they want to make. I think one of the stories that I like to tell that illustrates how a re-education that is, to your point, less transactional and more relational. We went to North Carolina, a very small town in North Carolina, with a bundle of small films for reproductive justice. And during the Q&A portion, a woman stood up and said, "I hope I never have an unplanned pregnancy story in my home." But the visual of that pregnancy test reminded me of the 2 lines from the COVID test and what happened to my family and how we couldn't find information and we didn't have access to vaccines. And I was reminded how an unplanned pregnancy and COVID had the same impact. And so for some of the funders that were in the space and that were hearing the stories that we were telling about that moment, some of them felt like it was a failure, because the feedback from the audience was not about reproductive justice. Instead of understanding that you were funding a bridge being built, you were funding an intersectional understanding happening, and us having the opportunity to tell that stories to all of the different types of people that were interested in supporting BIPOC storytellers. It was an opportunity for them to see that the impact sometimes happens on the ride home. Sometimes the impact happens in the spark of an imagination that leads to a different result in a voting booth. But when you go into investing in this, the understanding has to be as broad as the possibility of storytelling. And when you're able to set that expectation with those who are investing in film, then it opens up an opportunity for them to be more generous, because their curiosity and their imagination removes barriers in what they're able to create and fund and support in the world. And so from our perspective, that's been what's made a huge difference, is from investing in the screenwriter, to the filmmaker, to the cinematographer, to the set designer. Everyone sees possibilities that they never saw before by understanding the possibility of story.
That's incredible. That's really beautiful. I think that the other thing that I hear in that too is, for the expectation setting is really important for the incoming funders. And also, the incoming funders definitely need to come in with a very healthy dose of curiosity. Coming in ready to learn, ready to ask questions before coming in thinking that they know exactly how this is gonna play out. And I feel like you were saying something to me earlier, Jess, about how burnout is really real too when people are kind of coming in new to funding films. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, excuse me, we have a responsibility when it comes to introducing funders to the field to make sure that we're expectation setting appropriately. Impact investing in film doesn't have the same kind of financial payoff that impact investing can have in other spaces. Sometimes we're talking about like 80% return on investment being a strong return. That's not what investors are really thinking about. So to not like churn and burn through a lot of particularly individual investors, we need to be really setting expectations about what it looks like in terms of how they're thinking about their broader portfolio, where film fits in, and why exactly they're interested in that. Again, it takes a lot of communication, a lot of conversations to make sure that we're setting these kind of shared expectations.
I think it's funny. It sounds like we have to do storytelling before you can even start the storytelling. You got to like storytell to the funders before you can actually make the story. So actually, this kind of gets into another question I had, which is, you know, what are some of the obstacles to folks? Like, I think there are, for instance, we talked about, you know, even just kind of knowing the jargon, knowing the lingo, knowing the people. But I'm like, what are some of the things that feel like really obvious barriers for new funders to be coming in, and any ideas on or things that you see that are happening to sort of open those floodgates a little bit more?
I think we're relatively new in terms of funding. We've started funding projects about 5 years ago, and one of the things that is kind of a constant issue for us is that the traditional Hollywood system views this as free money, and it's something that doesn't need to be recoupable, or perhaps it could be additive to what they were already going to spend, so it reduces some of their risk. And our business model is based off of a return on all of our investments so that we can continue making more projects and making more impact. So a lot of times what I've learned is having someone who's very production-minded and creative-minded, who understands the system that we're about to enter into, is really helpful, because they can speak that language, and they can say, well, no, let's look at that budget again, and let's bring this down to a more manageable number so that we can all benefit on the upside. And so really dispelling that this, as an outsider, we're willing to spend our money and see how it rolls. We know what we're doing is the mantra, and that we're going to go in with an action plan of actually benefiting ourselves in this process as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the barriers that we experience is a misunderstanding, a misperception that the finished film is the end. When you were speaking earlier about the impact campaign, it's something that I think that folks that are funding in this space right now may not understand as fully how important it is, because culture is moving so differently. Like, we live in a time when 20% of folks get their news from podcasters and TikTok and Instagram, where 40% of folks say that gaming and podcasts are their primary form of entertainment. And I saw a stat on the way here that said 50% of Americans can't define democracy. I think we're living in a time where the impact campaign is as important for funding as the finished product sometime, because that is how folks find their audience. That's how they find the movable. That's where they make the connection so that folks stay a part of their career and not just this moment in time. And for our work, it's been really important to have those conversations, regardless of the type of funder, to say there's a moment of celebration when the film is complete, and then the work begins. And it's okay, and it's beautiful, and we can be just as excited about it. Yeah.
There's also, in nonfiction in particular, this kind of straddling of the commercial kind of streamer studio space and the nonprofit movement organization, arts organization space. And there's like tension, rightfully so, between those two spaces. And when we're talking about media for public good, and also maybe we have a strategy of bringing a certain film to Netflix for a wide kind of global release, there is this question of like, when is this philanthropy kind of offsetting the bottom line of corporations, especially? That was really ubiquitous in the time where there was a lot of streamer money. We were seeing bigger ticket sales, and a lot of foundations were investing in historically excluded and marginalized voices, kind of filling that development gap in the pipeline. Now we're not in that space as much, but there's a real gap that I think sometimes folks on the philanthropy side want to kind of figure out how to bridge to get the commercial and studio interests to somewhat align, but actually the philanthropy needs to be aligned with the interests of the creators and the movements that the media is serving, and not worried as much about its position related to the streamers and studios.
That's also very powerful. I think this also speaks to just business model in general, even to what you were just kind of talking to, these kind of like media for public good versus media that's going to be meant to be on a streaming platform. How does that even show up in the sort of earlier parts, like the earliest stages of developing a project, especially as the creators? Like, how are you supposed to be really thinking about that and knowing where to be looking for money based off of what kind of outcome you're trying to have?
Yeah, I mean, for us, that has meant having a hybrid structure where our production company operates in a typical production company structure, and we have fiscal sponsorship across our whole slate so that we can bring philanthropic money into each film and into our operations to support our impact campaign and engagement and some mentorship and apprenticeship work that we do. It also means like, that can look like and mean different things for different people, but it's sort of how do we utilize parts of different systems that can serve our work, understanding that we might not be located particularly under one umbrella, which relates back to the thing I was saying before about kind of the tensions between philanthropy and the commercial space.
That's interesting. I also am like, here, I'm like, to come back to you, Annie, because I'm like, well, it sounds like maybe there's like these pieces here. What you're describing sounds like it's a unique structure. Also, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, perhaps. Like there's some salvageable pieces here that are maybe worth building on. I'm just like, I'm trying to digest maybe what I'm taking. This is like real-time learning for me. But like maybe there are some pieces to build on. Obviously some pieces that are very much not working, but also, which this is not alien to anything in any industry, sort of the way that money comes in, what it's purposed for, very much also has an outcome on what that project is ultimately going to do or be able to do.
Yeah, I think the outcome is definitely something that you keep in mind from the onset. So you have to definitely kind of forecast.
Yes.
What you're trying to go for and what you can achieve with it, and also be realistic, right? If I have a film that's going to be very small budgeted,
yes,
to do a $12 million campaign, an impact campaign to support that is unrealistic. But if
right.
I have a very large Hollywood budget, then there's a way for me to translate that into a equally large impact campaign that carries on that message into the future. Does that answer your question?
Yes, so
okay.
Got it. Like there's also like a right sizing okay. there as well. Well, and I think that this is also now getting my wheels turning, because in this sort of tech space, building alternatives and alternative business models, alternative funding structures is one of my favorite songs. But it is also something that's like very much at the margins of the conversation of what is happening in the technology industry as well, even though like, for instance, venture capital, which is like the big name of the game in tech, is purposed for a certain kind of outcomes. It's purposed to make billion-dollar businesses that make software that eat the world. And so if you want something that's gonna be more socially conscious, like, is not always aligned most of the time with venture capital, and these other kind of funding options are very few and far between. And so to hear you also just speak to this interesting structure that you're trying, to also hear Amit, you talk to like these different kinds of campaigns and ways of engaging. I'm also just interested to know, like, are there any other kind of creative or interesting ways? And I feel like we haven't even touched on crowdfunding as well, that allows other people to just kind of come in and support projects. But I'm just interested to know what other kinds of alternatives or new emerging ways for supporting these projects are you seeing in the field, like any kind of bright spots out there?
So there's a company that I'm working with right now, and they're trying to figure out the algorithm of what is going to work impactfully, and also like exactly what you were talking about, like bridging the impact with like the big studios. And something that they've come up with recently is, have you guys gone on TikTok and you see these short form stories where it's like I got fired from my job, and then my boss came, and it's almost like it's like someone from Russia made it, or someone from like Mexico. You guys know what I'm talking about? Okay, so there's this company is using that as a model to figure out. They're making these short form stories and seeing what people gravitate towards to see what they can expand upon that the market is interested in to make long form stories of, which I feel like within that, for myself as an artist, I'm at a crossroads of like, but fuck, I want to make art for me. Like that's the shit that's impactful, right? Like when it's things that we've experienced and have been through, like to your point of a story of someone seeing a pregnancy test and the COVID test, like shit, like wow, as a filmmaker myself, the artist, I'm like, that's a story I would love to see. Because like you said, the ROI isn't then and there. How many artists do we know who've created things that have never experienced the success of their time, and years later, you know, films that have come back and we're like, it didn't get its day, but 15 years later, it's like it made a pop and everybody made their money back or what have you. So as I was hearing it, like my money-making brain is like, oh, fuck yeah, like this sounds exciting. And then I sit back a little and I talk with my team of lawyers and managers, and they're like, but is Annie the artist invested in it, or is Annie the brand and money-making machine engine invested in it? And I'm like, can they be both? How do we do that?
You touch upon something that's really important, I think, is the importance of data and using data. I think there's several companies that are trying to test, that are kind of using a Netflix-like platform that will put a log line, kind of a mock-up poster, and then test it with their audiences and see the response of their clickability, if they actually will click on the title. And using that as kind of ammunition to go in and get traditional financing, because if you can use real data to convince people saying that this is more likely to get clicked on, then people are more inclined to invest. And you can also see the same thing with, if you look at Reese Witherspoon's kind of book club that she set up. She makes deals with all these writers of books to be able to essentially test them with her fan base, and the response she gets will give her ammunition to go into the traditional studio system and say, here's the feedback we've gotten. There is a fan base that will come to this. At least 10% would mean considered a hit for you. And so that model is, I think, it's maybe working with the traditional model, but we are definitely relying on technology and data and technology to help us with that.
I love that I was just gonna say, I love that there is a solution there to like latch onto. I also am questioning even in that, I'm like, if you're really like an artist, like, are you the person that's going, well, let me get my ROI spreadsheet pivot table ready for the big business? I'm like, dang, that is like.
It's the daily struggle.
Yeah, I'm like, it's hard out here in these streets.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to be responsive to the algorithm. I don't want to make things that it's like shown that audiences want. I actually want to create new things that draw in audiences that they didn't expect to come to. And I want to think about audience in the way that I think about organizing, where we're starting with our core, most central audiences, and we're reaching audiences cumulatively through whatever is sparked in those core audiences. If I'm at a point where I'm studying what possibilities are available based on the algorithm and data telling me what audiences want, I got to get out of this field.
I feel your pain.
Yeah. Aisha.
I think that one thing that's been really interesting for me to see is gaming. We've had folks in the gaming world reach out to filmmakers. I think things like The Last of Us on HBO have shown that gaming stories can translate into stories that are told on different screens. And so we've had some interest from gaming to talk to mid-career, early career filmmakers, storytellers, screenwriters to say, why don't we start building this world here so that you get an audience. These folks get to world build through your eyes in this game, and perhaps, this leads to a different screen. I don't think that that's, the begin-all, end-all solution, but it's been really interesting to see gaming, which doesn't have the best reputation in protecting and empowering BIPOC
It does
folks,
not.
to be willing to have trans characters, Black characters, science fiction characters that look very close to marginalized communities, and to see what is the possibility of storytelling and to empower them in a way that is different than what we've seen in other sectors. So it's, for me, it's a moment of, with so many people spending their time connected to that space, how do we teach gaming now about how to interact with storytellers in a way that is less extractive, but that leads to a possibility that's different?
Love it. And I love there's like a seeing of opportunity in these kind of unexpected spaces there that I think is also pretty key to bringing in new minds, new voices, hopefully new dollars. I want to ask Amit a question, then I'm gonna open it up here. So like, there's gonna be a mic that'll go around, so get your question ready. But because I know that, you said something earlier about, the selection of the projects that you decide to do at one community, it also needs to make this return, right? And so I'm imagining that there's some amount of ideas and things that really seem like, just to Annie's point, seem like these really compelling stories that, the artist and all of us are like, yes, let's see that. But for whatever reason, the pivot tables did not yield the right answers. How do those decisions get made?
It's really hard.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it falls upon myself and two other people at our company who represent the content team. I was having a conversation earlier today about the type of content that we are naturally gravitated to as impact-minded people, as people who read the news and are staying abreast of all the current affairs and what changes we need to make. And so oftentimes those really, I call them earnest projects because they really do want to change the world very quickly by educating people very quickly. The challenge I have is, in order for something to be considered a hit and to get the maximum amount of viewership, I almost have to regress the amount of impact I put into a project to sometimes the starting point for someone to learn. And so that's where our model comes in handy, because we're not trying to, our model is kind of based off of the marriage equality movement in 2008. Our CEO met with the marriage equality advocates, the lawyers that actually helped pass it, and he asked them, how did we go from a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage to full marriage equality in 10 years, half a generation, which is really unheard of in activism. And they said it was Will and Grace. It wasn't a Brokeback Mountain, which I think is a more superior piece of art. It is, Oscar-worthy. It is cinematic gold. But it was the thing that was fun and easily digestible and non-threatening to the audiences that needed to change. And because it was non-threatening, they allowed their kids to watch it. And it's those kids, when they became voting age 10 years later, that made the shift. And so it's oftentimes having to look at what the most immediate need is, look at what's happening politically, and see where the starting point needs to be, and then start there. What that means for us is that we're constantly saying no to really good projects that mean well, but does not take into account commercial viability. And that for us is just kind of, it's hard to do, but we have to go down that route.
Yeah, that sounds really tough. But also maybe putting some vegetables in the spaghetti sauce here.
A lot of vegetables, but cleverly. Like a side character who has a really special story that could be a spinoff.
I think there's definitely something to Will and Grace in terms of the contribution that it made, but also there was so much queer organizing, there was so much queer media making and art making, community building that was happening alongside that I think it's a little reductive to point to Will and Grace only, and there's certainly a role for the sort of mainstream commercial, easy, fun kind of media to pull people into movements. But we're talking in that case about the people the furthest away from us. There's a lot to do with the communities that are closer to us and more aligned or just a little bit unaligned. And I really think we're doing ourselves, the field, and our communities a disservice if we're only thinking about the broadest commercial reach, and I think we can do better than that.
Annie, it looked like you were going to say something too.
I just love you guys so much. This is so amazing. There's so many questions that I had personally about figuring out art and what I want to do next, right? I'm 6th generation, born and raised East LA. I identified with people like Bette Midler and Barbara Streisand, but when I showed up into the room as a 9-year-old actress, they'd go, "Can you do an accent?" And I'd be like, "Of course I can, darling." They're like, "Not that one." And so hearing everything that you guys are saying, it's inspiring me to root deeper into my artwork as far as not just going where I'm invited, but creating a whole new space of the things that I want to see myself in, because I know I'm not the only one. So that's like everything that you guys are saying, it's like making me emotional, because it is so frustrating, because that's why I have been looking to these different tech companies of like, what's the thing that's going to get to me? My brain has operated in, I'm going to do this project, I'm going to do that project, so I can do this project, so people can see me in this light, they fall in love with me, and then I can make all the other shit that I want to fucking make. And hearing the conviction that you all have. And also that's why I'm here as well, because I've stuck true to who I believe I am, or who I believed I was at that moment, right? But being here, staying curious, because as I'm on this panel, I'm like, why the fuck am I here? Initially, right? Because I'm hearing you guys say these powerful things, and I'm like, oh, that's why. This is exactly why, because I do this work forward-facing in a different way, and I'm supposed to go forth and take parts of this with me and remain curious, so I can go into these rooms when I'm speaking to investors and know that I am the expert on Annie Gonzalez, and that's what I'm selling.
Yes.
So thank you guys.
Yes. I love that. And I even think there's like, to add on to that, that there's this piece that is also showing up in all 4 of your responses that are in some ways like very different kind of like entry points and sort of a ways of attacking it, whether it be something that might be looking for broader appeal, whether it be something that is like, no, we're gonna stand on this, and like this is what it's gonna be. It's gonna be this unapologetically, and also just to even think about like the places where we're just trying to like let someone who is, you know, new and has some incredible talent that needs to be seen, like, can we find a way to get this done? So I think all of these are just very, very powerful, wonderful ways to be engaging. I'm very excited about it. I would love to hear from the audience. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, my name's Teresa. Thank you very much for the panel. I have a question, perhaps elaborating, Jess, if you could, or the other panelists, on defining impact, because you were talking about intersectionality, or maybe there are other ways that makes it hard to define. Can you give some other examples on what that might be? Like, for example, I've used like net score metric, like 1 to 9, or 1 to 10, would you recommend this activity or this film to others? But there are many other sophisticated models, but yeah, thank you.
That's such an interesting question, I think. You know how when you say a word over and over and over and over and it starts to sound really, really unfamiliar? Impact is really starting to feel like that to me in terms of how it is used over and over and over in kind of this blanket way where we all have different definitions and different kind of philosophical and different working definitions. And I think it could serve the field in our projects if we kind of step back from this broad blanket term and actually just define what are we doing with this particular film? How is this particular film serving communities, serving movements? That might be some quantitative elements that may have some qualitative elements. And I also think there is a little bit of there can be a bit of narcissism to this idea of impact and what our films can accomplish and do, because one film, one piece of media is not a silver bullet solution to any of the key public issues of our time. We need a lot of different stories from different vantage points that hit different communities. We need very broad ones, and we need more niche in particular and targeted storytelling. And so I would actually be happy to like kind of X out the word impact and be like, don't say that, tell me what you really mean instead of impact.
Like, what do you want to happen?
I totally agree. I feel like the word impact has become so all-encompassing that it doesn't allow you to have broad view and specificity at the same time. One of the things that we developed with a bunch of narrative strategists is we call it a feelometer, and it's based on questions that measure empathetic responses. And it's emojis. It's emojis on a page. Like, did this film move you from this face to this face, and if so, how much? But the questions are based in empathy building, and when you're there are the more qualitative measures, like would you recommend this? But if you are able to bring in, from an empathetic perspective, am I changing minds? Am I moving hearts? Am I taking those first incremental steps to societal change through narrative change? It gives you more, not that data is the only thing that's important, but it gives you more data to have different conversations for folks that are coming into finance conversations with different goals. If you're able to have just a few empathy measures in the same space as the qualitative. And so that's something that we found to be very effective in moving conversations and setting expectations at the same time.
I will take emojis over spreadsheets any day, just to be clear.
Please,
To be
yes,
clear.
please.
There was another question.
I've been here at the Impact Lounge listening to panels, and I'll tell you one of the things that strikes me that's so beautiful. I hear the words community. I hear the words working together. I hear the words going around the structure, right? But there's an elephant in that room. The elephant in the room is the patriarchy, right? Because so what we're all talking about is a more natural version of communicating. You guys at all contemplate how we're gonna move on from the patriarchy to whatever's next?
Burn it down.
Well, my bracelet that I have on says fuck the patriarchy, right? So I have a couple of if anybody wants one. But I think it's less attack, more.
Like, what's beyond the patriarchy?
How do we move away from it?
How do we move away from the patriarchy?
Replace the natural, the feminine, and move away from it.
This is interesting. I feel like this is a larger philosophical question. But I mean, like, I want to say a thing about it, which is that I'm like, I too would like the patriarchy to not patriarchy. I think that, like, listen, I'm a Black woman in America. I think that, like, I've shifted a long time ago from the idea of, like, orienting myself and my work towards, like, how do I make the patriarchy not exist? Instead, I'm like, what is the best way for me to create the kind of environments inside of this? Because I feel like we use this metaphor a lot in the project of it, like, kind of being like water that we're all swimming in. Because I'm like, our society is like terraformed around it, and it's inescapable. And so I'm like, the best thing that I have found so far, I think it's like a progression. I'm like, I think it's this today, and then there might be more in the future that does actually start to see transitions happen. In fact, like, I kind of believe in this idea of, the things moving from a high concentration to a low concentration, but you gotta kind of start the thing that is at least the low concentration. Like, you gotta provide alternatives, you gotta provide choice. And so to me, it kind of feels like building these sort of like oases or like these bubbles inside of it. Like, this reminds me of even conversations I've been in with other Black folks where they're just like, well, we should just like build a compound in Africa. And I'm just like, Africa is still on planet Earth, right? Like, so I'm like, it's not even about, in some ways, like escaping it as much as it is about like, how do you build the things, how do you build the arc, if you will, that like your people can fit on and you guys can thrive there. And also figuring out like, what is the sort of connector between that and like what exists already. To me, I feel like it's a lot of the tools in the building are in transition, because I'm like, right now, I also like, there's a part of me that's also like, burn that shit down. But it's also kind of like, but wait, what's gonna exist in the after of that thing? And like, to me, there's lots of green shoots, but nothing that has actually taken root in a like organized collective way that doesn't then create a vacuum for more badness to fill it. So I'm like, I think it's like bubbles and oases right now, and then linking them together over time can actually maybe then transition and shift into a different paradigm. That's my theory, but I'm just a hunch.
I like that, the idea of creating your own reality. I mean, we hear that a lot. Like, I don't know if you guys ever listen to like Abraham Hicks or any of these like, you know, Wayne Dyer, like all these like thought leaders that talk about creating it first and then, like how you said, integrating that, right? Because being beautiful and being ugly hold the same tyranny over you. So you know, everything being super masculine or everything being super feminine, it's not a way of balance, like the yin and the all of that. So I like the idea of creating the compound in your mind, and what if walking into the world, what would that look like to then create art within that sort of like scope of, say if I didn't have everything outside of me fighting against me, what would I do? How would I be? I would be Barbara Streisand.
Yes. And I feel like also to even build on what Annie's saying, there's this like, when we come back into narrative change, when we come back into storytelling, it's like, when I think about some of the work that I'm doing, I'm like, there are actual like kind of pieces of infrastructure, like social infrastructure that my job entails doing, which, you know, might be anything from trying to reinvent the way that a contract is formed to, I don't know, setting up community controlled funds so that like people can organize themselves and not ask Daddy Warbucks for $5 to like have a meeting about something that's important. But like while all of that stuff is happening and actually you start to see things happening that are moving in the right direction, like the actual stories and the narratives, it's like being able to sort, again, it kind of comes back to them, like even if you have solved this like amazing problem, like being able to point to it and be able to get people excited about it and getting people to think differently about just the possibility of it all, like it doesn't work without that piece. It has to be there. It absolutely has to be there. And it just like allows so much more imagination for the world that doesn't exist yet, that I think we all kind of need to just like do some kind of shared sense making and come to some shared agreements about like, well, at least we're going in this direction. We know that much, and like that shit doesn't feel patriarchal. You know what I mean? So that's what I got. I don't know.
What's coming up for me as you're both talking is also just the creativity and inspiration of the abolition movement and what it has to offer us in terms of, you know, what's commonly misperceived as like the burn it down, break and dismantle the carceral system. It's actually like, what are we building? And it's a foundationally creative movement. That's what are we building in the small, like
Yes.
the funds that you're talking about that are community controlled, that can create the roots of the infrastructure that will look different over time. So that's what I want to point to, you know, thinkers like Miriam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore.
Yes. And I do think like, I don't know, this is, now I'm like doing a little bit too much here, because I'm like, this is maybe a slightly controversial thing. I really do think that there are actual like things that we can learn from the sort of structures that exist that can be co-opted for our own purposes. I feel like if we're looking at things politically even, I'm like, the right co-op shit that the left does all the time and turns it into things that benefit them. I feel like we're not so good at doing that. Yeah. And like there are things that they have like figured out and come up with that I actually think could be useful for us if we applied them to our own strategies and we're able to just like not allow ourselves to come into the sort of deficit of like what we know this thing is intending to do, and actually looking at them more like tools for us to apply our own use cases to them. Does this make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Jessica, to what you said earlier about like liberalism kind of being like fucking with us because we think we need to say everything correctly, so nobody is saying anything. Like even you right now, like course correcting, this might be controversial. Like what's the point of us making art and doing the thing if it's not that? Like that really stuck with, that's so exciting. I don't know, that's really exciting. I like that. Let's use it all.
I think there's a lot of possibility there. Were you about to say something?
I was just going to add to what you were saying. At Cultural Power, we always say that culture moves faster than politics and economics, but immediately followed is the backlash. And when we get into these moments of backlash, it's like fight or flight kicks in. And we revert back to words and terms that mean a lot in sometimes our movements, and we talk about white supremacy and we talk about patriarchy, and I think we forget that for the folks that are feeling the backlash the most, sometimes they don't have space for those terms. I'm reminded of my days, back in my lobby days. We won't talk about those dark days, but except for this one story. I work for a religious freedom organization, and we went to this small town in Arizona where they were wilding on church and state violations. And a farmer stood up and said, all of this stuff is beautiful. I understand that this is based on colonialism, which is entrenched in patriarchy and white supremacy, but I'm the first generation of my family that's been able to afford a Bible. I don't have a God belief because my family can never afford it. So you're talking here, and my family we don't have the privilege of being there with you. And so, bringing that full circle, I think when we talk about how do we dismantle the patriarchy, when we talk about how do we dismantle white supremacy in a lasting and real way, I think we recognize moments of backlash for what they are. The backlash against the progress that's being made, and then we also realize that some of the folks that are most impacted by the backlash created by our progress will never see themselves inside of what we're doing. And if we want them to come along with us, it means those are the stories that we make sure don't get lost in us addressing the larger systemic change.
That just gave me goosebumps. I'm like, yes, clap. Clap. I know I saw another hand up. There was another question. Yes.
Hania, just a question to the panel about what role, if any, you see film festivals having in advancing the ROI, and I'm trying not to say impact campaign, the thing you want to do with the film. Is there a role that you see film festivals playing not only in sort of advancing that work, but also in collaborating from a fund development, fundraising standpoint for that impact?
Yeah, I think film festivals have now become kind of the greatest source of press and the greatest source of exposure for projects, at least in my understanding. And that is also where conversations around impact actually matter, because you're able to talk freely. Once you get a distributor involved, then all of a sudden the messaging gets catered. So I think being at a forum like this, you're able to talk about what it takes to make a project like you're making, what the intended message is, what the hope is for it, and what we need to do still, and reaching the audience of investors who are also here to possibly meet filmmakers to invest in, or producers to invest in, or projects to support with their financing and carry on the impact campaign. So I think ultimately the festivals are probably the most unfiltered place for you to talk about your projects and get the attention you need.
At the same time, I think we've seen there's been a real concentration of power within a couple of very particular festivals. We're here at Sundance. That's one of those festivals where that concentration of power has been held. And it's been interesting as we've seen the sales out of Sundance becoming more uncertain, less lucrative. There are obviously a lot of negative sides to that, but I think one strength is actually leveling the playing field in terms of decentering the Sundance of it all. And when I say Sundance, I mean some of the other kind of most prestigious festivals. It gives us a chance to kind of define prestige on our own terms. And I'm saying that as producer with Film at Sundance, I really appreciate and am utilizing the platform of this festival as much as possible, and I don't think it should hold the center of gravity that it does.
I think film festivals, particularly some of the more identity-based film festivals, have provided a great platform for folks who are curious about financing film but not quite sure how to start, what's the language, what are the conversations like. I've worked with quite a few folks with the ability to fund projects in a significant way. And they send their attorneys or their wealth managers to film festivals on tours of the spaces first to learn the people, the places, and you'd be amazed how many filmmakers with films in these festivals have walked away from these folks because their business card says attorney instead of producer. And I think film festivals provide that entry place for folks that going back to curiosity, who are holding curiosity, but they could never just walk up to someone and say, I saw your short. Can we have a conversation about me funding it? And folks would look at them and say, you fund puppies. like what are you going to do for, like, do you understand what you're coming into? So I actually think film festivals hold a significant value for the next generation of film financiers.
Well, I think that is a fantastic way to wrap this panel. I just want to thank you all again for such brilliant and rich insights. I feel like there's so many things that I'm taking away, but honestly, the biggest headline for me is that, we need this new wave of funders to come in if we're actually trying to, build our own or build alternatives, right? If we want different stories to be told, we need different funders. We need to try different models. We need to be trying like all different kinds of looking for different kinds of outcome and just having all of these different avenues in. So I just thank you so much. I would love if we would give them another round of applause. Thank you.